Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of M&M Podcast, and we're going to take a trip down memory lane today. We're going to talk everything and anything animated works, and movies and TV. And who better to
Yeah,
talk about this than with Mitch? Mitch, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing well, and I think we haven't really talked about animated movies or shows much at all. I think last time we did was when we did the Batman episode, our first episode, which don't go back and watch that one, or
No,
do
go
if you want
go
to
back and
laugh.
check out the
Yeah,
rough episode, please.
yeah.
Do us a favor.
See how far we've come. But yeah, I think it's a good topic because you know the animation, it's not seen kind of the same way as like live action for the most part. Um, But I think in recent years, people have recognized like the art and the creativity that could come from animated movies. And I think Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse was, I believe, the first animated movie nominated for any sort of Oscar Academy Award. I
Mhm.
think. Like, I don't think it was Best Picture or anything, but like, well, sorry, nominated for a non-animated category, I should say. Like,
That's true.
so I,
Yeah.
I don't
Mhm.
remember exactly which one it was, but I believe it was kind of a precedent-setting movie.
Mhm.
And you're right, like we are kind of throwing it back because a lot of these movies and shows you watch as a kid, of course, like Disney, Pixar movies, but a lot of them also stand the test of time and are still really enjoyable today.
Yeah, revisiting them. These are our favorite films and shows that we can go back to and we love. Because sometimes there's those kids movies you really enjoyed as a kid. You go back, you watch it, and Mitch, I know this probably happened to you too. You go
Mm-hmm.
back and watch them, and then you're like, "Wow, this is a piece of crap," and then you
Yeah,
just ruin that that innocent childhood image you had of that movie. But
yeah,
these ones, no, these stand the test of time, like you said.
definitely. And even like I find that with a lot of the live action kids show, we're at like because when Disney Plus came out and it was all available again, it's like, oh boy, like
Yikes.
this is bad. Like I remember watching like Hannah Montana, like I loved it as a kid. I was like, oh my God, Billy Ray Cyrus cannot act to save his life. He was so bad. Whereas actually, I find the animated work holds up better
Mm.
a lot of the time for like kids sort of things. But let's just go quickly through some of our favorites. In terms of shows, let me pull up the show. I would say for me, like I was a big as a kid, like I love DC.
Mm.
I didn't know I loved DC. I just loved like Batman, Superman, Justice League, and then Spider-Man was like the one other. I didn't know about the whole war between Marvel and DC. My parents got it for me. I liked it, so they get me more, like when they were trying to come up, get some new shows and new movies. So for me, I would say the pinnacle of animated shows, in my opinion, is Batman the Animated Series. And the cool thing about that show is, first of all, it's just a good show. Second of
Mm.
all, it's the best representation of Batman. And third, it's actually become the example. Like people use that to compare every other Batman work to, which is
Mm.
pretty impressive for an animated show that came out in like the early mid 90s
Yeah,
to have that much
uh,
power.
and I didn't know about. Look, I did know about the show, but I didn't really watch it until you showed me a few years ago. During pandemic, I came over and we just binged Batman animated series for like it was like a week. We watched
Mm-hmm.
most of it, and I loved it.
Yeah.
And it's great to see that that's like the benchmark of, or that brought Batman more to like the mainstream.
Yeah. That was huge. And the other thing with that is like it appeases everyone. It's like it appeases the hardcore Batman fan. It appeases kids. Even people who may not be the biggest Batman fan will be like, yeah, that was pretty good. So
Hmm.
it just shows to the quality of the show, the care they put into it, because they're people who loved comics. And that was kind of one thing I really wanted to mention with animated works is that's what brought comic books to the masses. Like comic books back in the day, it was like nerdy. People wouldn't really talk about it. It was not cool to be into comic books at all. But animated shows, I think, it brought it to a lot more kids, and then it became cool. It became part of the culture to be a Spider-Man fan, to be a Batman
Hmm.
fan, and so now you see all these Marvel movies, all these DC movies, and they're like dominating the film industry. When 20 years ago, 40 years ago, that would have been unheard of.
Yeah, and you see like you said, it just animation was a nice step from the comic book to the screen, like the silver screen, and then you go to the big screen. So it was and live
Exactly.
action because like without the animated works, Batman the animated series, like without that, the live action Batman like Christopher Nolan might not be a possibility because you
Mhm.
didn't bring it to the masses through animation.
Exactly. And that's the perfect way of saying it. It's almost like the animated series is the comic book
Mhm.
brought to life. And then almost any live action, it's never going to quite live up to it because there's certain limitations, but also things you can do in animation you can't do with live action, right? In terms of control of like performances and movements and effects, right?
Mhm.
So it's an interesting little debate, but that was one thing I wanted to mention because comic books and like Marvel and everything is so massive now. And without, obviously, you first need the comic books, but then also I think the animated movies were, like you mentioned, that middle step building block to making it just part of mainstream pop culture.
Mhm.
Um, and then looking sort of at the animated movies aspect, or no, let's go back to the shows. What would you say are a couple of your favorites?
A couple of my favorites, I know, again, I'm going back to the past here. Growing up, some of my favorites were Avatar: Last Airbender and Star Wars: The Clone Wars. And I have some other ones, but just going from the beginning there is I love these shows and they have a lasting influence. And I sat back and asked myself why. And it's because these shows are actually very mature for kids shows. Like they're catered towards kids, but they deliver in such a way where it's pretty tasteful with some of the like the heavy themes they have, and they come in like those like life lessons that you learn. Uh, but they don't dumb it down for you. They give it to you as is, and that's why I see like in a lot of new shows and animations, I see some younger kids watching. They're just there's no subtlety, there's no growth, there's no messaging. It's just like look at the flashing colors, look at this.
Yeah,
Maybe because I'm an adult and I'm looking at this now, but there's more there's more nuance and great storytelling in older shows.
yeah.
And I don't know if that's just like the artists back then, the different like the
Mhm.
culture around Hollywood and everything, but I
Yeah.
just found it like they gave good messages. And I don't know if
Mhm.
you found that, Mitch, with your stuff.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And like Batman the Animated Series, again, the cool thing with that is like it's animated, so your parents would let you watch it when you're 6 or 7 or 8 or 9. But there's some serious topics, and there's some messages to it to kids, but also watching it as an adult, it doesn't feel like they're just, dumbing it down like you mentioned and just creating this thing that's only meant for kids. Like adults can find the enjoyment too. And then Avatar: The Last Airbender, you mentioned. Anime is obviously a massive part of animated works. It may be the biggest part. Like I mentioned, comic books, I would say anime is number two. And that's another thing that
Mhm.
has exploded in our lifetime, where, again, like back in the day, maybe you would have made fun of for watching anime, whereas now that's normal. If you don't watch anime, you're almost the outlier, right?
Yeah,
And Avatar: The Last Airbender is probably the main show that got people into anime from this part of the world.
it's like it was even in the last it's just the last 5 6 years anime has really blown up in the Western world. Honestly, it's crazy because my friends got me into anime, and another one I was going to mention was Death Note. That's a great anime. That was one of my first ones I got me into it. And then there's just so many because people say anime and they're like, okay, if you don't know it, they just think it's anime. Whereas like it's
Mm-hmm.
just a style of animation where there's so
Yeah.
much different subgenres and everything, right? It's its own.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
basically just like saying animation, but it's just a different part of the world that does it and has a different style. But if I
Mhm.
just said, "Oh, it's what are you watching?" "Oh, I'm watching an animated show." It doesn't mean you know exactly what you know what I mean? Like it can
Yeah.
mean anything, and that's anime is the same thing. It's just a different style and a different like culture which
Mhm.
influences the style and the art and everything. But yeah, like we would be remiss not to mention anime. I'm glad we talked about it because that is a massive part of the animated works and
Mhm.
the culture, even now in like North America and in the West.
Mhm.
And then looking at movies, obviously Disney and Pixar are the main sort of movies that we would watch as kids in terms of the animated works. And for
Mhm.
me, I actually forget which I think Ratatouille's Disney.
It's Disney
Ratatouille
Pixar.
Disney?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that to me, that would be my favorite of sort of the animated like Disney Pixar movies.
Mhm.
What would you say are some of your favorite animated
I'd
movies?
say like in our list here we got Disney Pixar. What I grew up watching that. I love those animated movies. Again, great family content, great messages and stuff like that too. But Mine is just a little before the Disney Pixar boom in the early 2000s, or alongside it, but it was just Disney. My favorite has to be Emperor's New Groove. That is a comedy with David Spade. You have John Goodman in it as well. Just one of my favorite all-time like comedies, because it's that and Shrek, I'd have to say. Maybe my two,
Yeah.
because not only are they just hilarious for kids, the adults, there's adult jokes every other line. And the thing is, like, as a kid, way over my head, I didn't see any of it. And then as I got a little older, I watched it and I was like, how the hell did they get away with that in there?
Yeah.
And so you start seeing these things where it's like it's fun for the adults and the kids, and that's why you're not dumbing it down. Like we said, you're catering to the well, you're not catering, you're supplying to the whole audience, right? You're
Mhm.
hitting all the demographics.
And
And
it's
I see
funny.
that. Mhm.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I see that in Emperor's New Groove. Also Lilo and Stitch. That's the other huge animated movie I have to say is like they have adult
Mhm.
jokes in there. They have good wholesome themes, and they also just have just great entertainment for kids.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, it's funny when like kids shows kind of put some jokes in there for adults. Like going back to the shows, it's like I think Phineas and Ferb did that a little bit. Where like
Yeah.
if you rewatch that, there's some jokes that like would definitely have gone over your head as a kid, but if you were a parent watching with your kid, or maybe a much older sibling, you would have gotten it. And then also looking at like the animated movies. I mean, Toy Story obviously is a classic, great story. Tim Allen, Tom Hanks.
Mhm.
Those are obviously great kids movies. I really like the original Incredibles. I love that one when I was a kid.
I have to
But
mention
I
that's
would
one of my
say,
favorites. Sorry, yeah, keep going.
mhm. And then I would say it's not the entire movie, but I would say one of the best, maybe the best in my opinion, my favorite piece of animated work would be like the intro sort of scene of like 10, 15 minutes of Up.
Mm.
And if you watch it again, like it holds up, like the animation, everything. It's just beautiful. Like the music, it's beautiful and heartbreaking, obviously.
You make me cry on camera, Mitch.
And it just like it does a perfect job because it then cuts to the guy who's all cranky and bitter and like he has his house and then there's all the sky rise, like the
Mhm.
high rises everywhere, and he won't sell his land and all that. And I really like the movie too. Like I think it's a really good movie as well. But I think the intro of Up is one of the best works of animation that I've ever seen.
Mhm.
And if you haven't seen it, which I don't know how you haven't, check it out and you'll see why. Because it's fantastic.
Yeah, and probably the best way I gotta ask you, like, in terms of the animation, like, what's that feeling you get from it? Because I mine would be like storybook kind
Mhm.
of like tale, almost kind of animation, if you could.
That I think that's exactly how I would say too. It's like with comic books, but also with story, like just the story itself coming to life, and you almost have more buy-in because they're not real people. So like if I'm watching a movie, right? Any movie, let's just say Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, great movie, great
Mhm.
acting. But I know it's Brad Pitt. I know it's Leo DiCaprio. I know who these people are. I've seen them in other movies. Margot Robbie, same thing. With an animated movie or show, these are original characters who don't actually exist in any other universe. Now maybe they do because of comic books or
Mhm.
whatever, but for the most part, it's like original, unique characters you've never seen before. So you don't know exactly how they're going to behave, how they're going to act, all that. So that's sort of what I love about animation is the creative aspect, how you're able to, as writers and filmmakers, literally, like not literally, but like bring your story to life, right,
Mhm.
for the screen.
Yeah, and
Whereas with
specific.
like, real movies or like live action movies, you're dependent on actors a lot of the time. Maybe they don't put in the same performance you want or the effects, you don't have the budget, right? Whereas animation, you have complete creative control.
And exactly, with actors, they might have a different spin on the character that, as a director or cinematographer, you don't agree with. Whereas if you're animation, you have like, yeah, creative control, which is
Mhm.
awesome.
Yeah.
And so I would say TV shows we went through. Movies though, you said one of your favorites was Ratatouille. If you could pick
Yeah.
just a couple more, I want to hear the other
Yeah.
ones you kind of like.
Well, I did mention Toy Story and Incredibles. I did have
Oh,
a
you
tough
did.
time
Yeah.
because like a lot of people do really enjoy watching the movie. For me, I'm more show. I'm more of a animated show fan.
Okay.
Whereas I think you were the other way around. You were more movies.
Mhm.
So I'm more of a animated show person. So like Family Guy, Batman, the animated series. I also love the Spider-Man animated series, which
Mhm.
is from the 90s as well, which was fantastic. I love that. Still holds up. So I love that as well. But in terms of movies, and then the other one I would say is probably my favorite animated movie after Ratatouille, and it goes back to Batman the animated series. Kind of the same thing. It's Batman Mask of the Phantasm. And it's kind of the same thing because it's the same actors, same crew, like same writers and producer director in that.
Mhm.
Because they made it during Batman the Animated Series as it was coming out. But it is a true movie, and I would highly recommend it. A lot of people think it's the best Batman movie of all time.
Mm.
And I would say, I would probably agree. I probably would agree. Because I love The Dark Knight. I think The Dark Knight is a better movie than Batman Mask of the Phantasm, but Batman Mask of the Phantasm is a better Batman movie, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you and Al both told me that's one I have to watch.
Mm-hmm.
Mask of the Phantasm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll have to get Al back on at some point. Maybe our 1 year anniversary or something on the show.
Have to be. We'll talk Spider-Man with him. That's something we tentatively talked about. So
Yeah, we definitely need to do an episode on that because we did our Batman episode, which again would be hilarious to watch now.
yeah.
But yeah, so we'll definitely have to get to the Spider-Man, and that kind of fits in obviously to our topic today. And then as a filmmaker, and we kind of touched on this already, but and I know you don't work in animation, but what would you say is sort of like the benefit? Like if you had a script, like you had a story and you thought animation was the correct way to go, what would be kind of the benefits of it? And then maybe some of the downsides, some of the limitations for turning it into an animated movie or
In
show.
terms of the benefits would be, like you said, like creative control, which is a great one. You don't have to there's a lot less moving parts that you would in like a live action performance. Like you wouldn't have like a lighting team, a certain you wouldn't have like, oh, what am I saying? Like you would have a sound team, but you wouldn't have a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of people running around set. You wouldn't
Yeah.
be on a set with locations and dealing with weather and other people and locations permitting and everything. You'd just be in the studio making it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot less labor
Variables.
going into it, and that's
Mm-hmm.
why they're like cheaper to make. But in terms of the drawbacks, I would say one of the drawbacks is it depends on the animation you're doing. Because I love cell animation, which is like the hand drawn, as you mentioned before, like the hand drawn
Oh
ones
yeah,
where you're just actually
the old
going
school.
through. And I find that just like that's like artwork. I find it very beautiful, like pieces of
Mm-hmm.
work. Like you look at like the 90s was Disney's Renaissance, they say, with like the Little Mermaid, you get Aladdin, Mulan, Tarzan, like all those movies, Beauty and the Beast, like they're very beautifully drawn
Yeah,
things, except that takes a long time to draw.
yeah.
Whereas the animation, like computer animation now, is easier to make, but I just don't find it as beautiful as as
Mm-hmm.
the drawn stuff, you know.
Yeah, and that makes sense, and I would tend to agree because that is primarily the animated material that I consumed and watched today. So yeah, that's a good point. And like you mentioned, for the benefits, it's just less variables, right? Because you're talking about
Mhm.
weather, costs, permit, like all sorts of things that go into it. You just don't have to worry about that. And even like with actors, it's just the script. They just have to talk. You don't have to worry about them how they move or whatever. And so yeah, it's probably a bit easier, but there's definitely downsides. There's definitely downsides as well. And then I guess we could finish up with maybe like a Mount Rushmore of animated work. So like four pieces of animated work that you have as like your four favorites.
Mount
So
Rushmore makes sense.
comment your four favorites, guys, if you're watching. But maybe we could go. Let's go a four pack. Let's each do a four pack if you want to go first, and then we can
All
talk
right,
about it.
all right. Let's see my Mount Rushmore. I have to say, I have to start off with Emperor's New Groove. I have to
Okay,
say
and
that
that's a movie.
movie. It's a movie.
Yeah,
Lilo and Stitch.
great
I have to
one.
say that. And then this was harder. I did two animated shows, but
Hmm.
Rick and Morty, which I
Okay,
really
yeah,
recommend to you, Mitch. I think you love that
yeah,
show.
that's a popular one.
Yeah. And then Avatar Last Airbender.
Yeah,
So
that
yeah,
one's huge.
I tried to pick him because like he had the adventure stuff, you had the raunchy comedy, and you had the wholesome kind of family comedy with the messaging. I just tried to pick out my absolute favorites, but that's if I had to, those ones.
Yeah, and that's a good group. There's some good like diversity in terms of like comedy, serious, movie shows. So that was a good mix. Mine is kind of similar,
But
I would
I want to
say.
hear it though. I want to hear it. Let's go.
I as you can tell, I'm definitely that's sort of what I think when I think of animation. What I love is the superheroes is what I loved, like as a kid
Hmm.
and still to today. So for my for my Mount Rushmore, I would go Batman, the animated series, Batman: Mask of the Phantasm, the movie,
Hmm.
Ratatouille. That's a little
Yeah, yeah.
different, and then the Spider-Man animated series from the '90s. Those would be
Hmm.
my four, because it's part of its nostalgia, what I grew up watching and loving, but I
Hmm.
still think it holds up now, and it's characters that I really like. So it's fun to sort of see live action Batman movies and Spider-Mans and still really love what like set me on, like turned me on to those characters, right? That lasted a lifetime being
I
a
just
fan of them.
yeah, I find it funny Ratatouille in there with all the superhero stuff.
Yeah,
It's just it shows because you like the different stuff too. You have a variety
yeah.
of shows and movies you like to watch. So
Because I just think Ratatouille, and like even if you ask like chefs and stuff, like they'll say that's like the best like cooking movie of all time, like a
mm,
movie about food, because they put so much care into the details of everything, the animation, the techniques. Um, it was just like it's such a good movie, like genuinely like such a great movie, and I would say that's probably the best animated movie in my opinion of all time. That and Batman the animated or Batman: Mask of the Phantasm would be my top two.
yeah, they're up there, man.
Yeah.
Ratatouille's a great movie. Yeah.
For sure. Well,
Mhm.
let us know your animated works, Mount Rushmore, in the comments. Like, subscribe, and reach out to us on our social medias at Podcast M&M on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram. Save it for the podcast.
Save
That's
it.
perfect. What you're
I'll save
talking
that. I'll
about.
save
That is
that.
absolutely perfect.